Politics aside, it doesn't matter who's president. The fundamentals are all the same when it comes to matters like this. All right, my friends, welcome back. It's been a while. I was offline and then I hurt myself really bad. And I couldn't do any videos. I could barely sit. I'm kind of getting over it right now, but I feel good enough. I was like, I can't get to 100 days of this conflict and not be able to do a video, especially in the lead up to 100 days. And so here I am, RK, your host. I have over 2 decades of experience in the space of energy intelligence. In a week, it's going to be 100 days of this conflict. My goodness. At least of the latest event of it. And so I figured, so much has been going on. If I try to go back and be like, okay, this vessel passed on this day, blah, 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 it will just be a 10-hour video. So I'm just going to sort of pick up and talk a little bit on a more strategic level of what's been going on. This is now approaching nearly 100 days of one of the world's most consequential disruptions in the energy market ever. And this has always been one of those scenarios of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The circumstances around it can differ. I mean, it could go everything from war like we're seeing now to, although technically it's not a war, but let's say conflict, like we're seeing now, all the way to some form of a natural disaster. And so there's always what if scenario of our worst case scenario. And of course, here we are in the worst case scenario. We're approaching 100 days, which is extremely frightening for the global energy markets and in turn consequential and problematic for the global economy. A lot of what is in the open source media is not fully accurate. It's not the full picture. It's underreported. I can tell you right now what is most concerning to me is actually what's not making the headlines. We continue to see, because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, that shipping remains constrained. And so inventories are declining, falling, essentially. We've talked about how that's led to fuel shortages globally, but the primary markets where this is being felt the most is in, of course, the Asian markets, and Southeast Asia in particular, has already started implementing austerity measures. And despite the repeated diplomatic efforts to try to come up with some form of an achievable and sustainable agreement with Iran, what's ended up happening is repeated failures in talks have led to continued uncertainty, and that there is no breakthrough in talks. Everybody's anticipating that. And you can see that happening in the markets and the general sentiment. But the reality on the ground is that we don't have that. And the reality is that that lack of confidence has already started to shift the market from something being solely a disruption into a full-on restructuring based on sentiment. And so after the failures to come up with some type of a long-standing agreement beyond just your occasional ceasefire that's announced, well, because of the failure to even come close to some of the terms, i.e. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, period, full stop, end of story. Well, because of the failure to be able to come up with an agreement around that context in particular, amongst other things, but that's really the main sticking point, at least from the public perception, the breakdown in those talks has led to a resumption, unfortunately, in kinetic activity again. There's been continued maritime security concerns. Right now, it really sucks because for the most part, most nations know that this isn't good for the long-term economy and stability, but there is no diplomatic off-ramp at this point. And so we're kind of stuck in this perpetual state of, at one point a ceasefire, at another point failure in talks, and at another point the closure of the strait and the periodic opening or passage of ships. And, the full picture is that while you might have over the last few weeks some shippers managing to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, the actual reality on the ground continues to be one that is really problematic. And my point in bringing this up is that while you may have heard about periodic passages of vessels through the Strait of Hormuz, that's not the actual reality on the ground. There continues to be major shipping disruptions, and LNG is one side of things, but there's also all of the byproducts, all of the cargo ships as well that are stuck there. And so you end up with a situation of like, who's passing when, where, and what is the order of passage as well. Like that's something that many people aren't really talking about. Like if the strait opens, who's actually passing it, and by what means and in what order. And so there's still a lot of chaos there. And so the reality is the disruption, it's going to take months. I think ExxonMobil came out and said it will take months for shippers to be able to get back into normal conditions. This isn't just a switch that you turn on and off. And that was my point about like, you know, when we first started talking about this, end of February, the disruption is not just a temporary one. If it continues for 3 months, which it now has, the problem becomes a systemic one. And you're talking about backlogs and backlogs of ships. And, you know, there's a lot of decision makers that I talked about earlier. There's the seafarers, there are the ship owners, there's the insurers. It's just not one organizational decision. And so this is a very complex, multi-layered and multifaceted problem. And so I would say, you know, some of the most important developments that have happened over the last couple of weeks is that there have been vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. A handful of passages does not mean normalization of activities again. Those are great developments, but it's not the full picture like I just highlighted and illustrated moments ago. There are incidents of attacks on vessels that are not being reported, and they are underreported. The frequency of attacks and the magnitude of attacks is not fully reported, if at all, in the mainstream media. Some of the incidents as well, you know, you'll run into situations where because of reputational matters or because of censorship of information, there's a lot that may not be reported because governments may not want to publicly acknowledge that these things are happening. And so make sure that you subscribe if you are interested in making sure that you continue to receive information that's not necessarily reported due to a factor of reasons that I just mentioned before. Meow, meow. Aww, be nice. Hello. You want to say hello? Hi. Say hello. Hi. Meow. Cutie. Okay. He does not like to be held, I'll tell you that. But he does like to curl up. Like if he comes and curls up on me, it's okay. But if I hold him, no, he doesn't like that. Hello. I'm sorry I carried you. And so what I'm noticing with the market is that it continues to trade as if there's some big resolution right around the corner. And you see that like, okay, you know, there's like the sentiment is really high because people think that there's going to be an agreement to some type of a like peaceful resolution this weekend, you know, on Saturday. It's like, yeah, but the reality is like, it's this cyclical ambiguity and uncertainty that's continuing. And, you know, my fear is that this will continue to be the new norm, you know, this perpetual state of like being on the verge of some agreement, you know, when in reality, we're just not there. I'm not seeing any resolution. I always hope for it, you know, because that's of course what's best for the energy industry, but it's the fact that we're here now and it's now 3 months and we're almost at the 100-day mark. You know, usually it's like the 90-day cycle and here we are, we just passed it. And, you know, the fact that we got to 90 days and we're still not at the point of having something solid, a framework agreement in place is, to me, just says that we're kind of going to be in this for a while at this point. And the markets are going to respond accordingly. in my opinion. Again, this isn't financial advice. I always put those disclaimers in the description box. What are we seeing on the oil and gas front? Crude inventories are declining. Diesel inventories are extremely tight. Gasoline inventories remain under severe pressure. The reason we haven't seen this like massive spike yet is that we're relying on existing inventories to sort of pump into the grid. Existing stocks can absorb the shock, but only for as long as they exist. And that's why I kept on underscoring the importance of the 90 days mark. Like if this continues on for 90 days, then we're going to start to really feel the effects of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the disruption to global oil supply and energy supply. For a while, the depletion of your stocks and inventories will help offset some of the losses, but those are falling and they will eventually run out. Inventories are not a supply source. They're just a bridge, and it's a temporary measure that you use to make sure that, spikes in prices don't happen instantaneously. June and July, we will see are extremely critical months. We've entered June now. It's the beginning of June when I filmed this video, and those are, traditionally high consumption periods where, you have people traveling, you have people going on summer vacations, a lot of our ACs are run. All of these prices will now face, what matters to Americans is that a lot of us are going to feel the spikes in our, electric bills and gas bills. All of this is going to be impacted as a result of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, or the continued closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The other thing is like, people will be like, oh, well, crude is in large part, still averaging at under $100 a barrel. Like, why isn't it much higher than that? Why isn't it $200? Why, Iran threatened that, okay, we'll get crude to $200. Well, why hasn't that happened? And the reality is that like, it doesn't happen overnight. This is that 90-day period again, where now we've passed 90 days. Now this is very critical times because we know that those inventories are running low or dry, and will eventually no longer be a bridge to be able to make sure that the prices at the pump don't go to, $9. If there was like a chain of events, you have the disruption, and then you have your inventory start to decline, and then you have the next step would be the wholesale prices start to rise. That would mean increase in transport costs. And once the transport costs go up, then the retailers start to adjust their prices. And then us, the American consumers, end up feeling the impact at the pump. And then it's not just the prices at the pump. I've underscored this in a lot of my videos. It's the prices in everything. The cost of goods goes up. The cost of utilities goes up. The cost of living goes up. And, this is why it's just, for me, when this first started, people were like not really seeing the writing on the wall. And I was like, well, if this continues on for 90 days, we're really going to start to feel the impacts, and we're going to get screwed because a lot of times people still have difficulty making ends meet. And, imagine the price of things, the price of gas at the pump doubling, or the price of, I always use the example of like, you think the price of eggs was bad several months ago, like you haven't seen anything. American consumers and globally, consumers around the world are going to feel this. I talk mostly from the vantage point of being an American and the impact that this would have to my fellow Americans. But, this is an issue around the world. I frequently speak with experts in the field of energy economics, and what I'm hearing right now is that, the greatest concern is that if this persists through the end of the month, then we will definitely be feeling those spikes. As I mentioned before, eventually all of those costs end up finding their way into the economy and like every sector of the economy for that point. That's kind of the latest. Now that, I'm able to move around again, I'll get back into a more frequent upload schedule. As I mentioned, every Sunday I'll come up with a SitRep. But before I close, I actually wanted to take the last portion of this video to talk about somebody that I knew who's passing late last week deserves attention from everybody in the energy world. And that is the unfortunate passing of His Excellency Abdullah bin Hamad Al Atiyah. He was known throughout the energy industry as the Godfather. I'm going to insert a photo of the two of us. I was very fortunate to hear firsthand stories from him. He would share lots of stories, and I spent several years working in that region and would meet with him, and we'd talk LNG and all of this. And I know that this is a significant loss, not just for those of us in the energy space, but to Qatar in general. It is worthwhile and important, I think, that we recognize his contribution in the energy industry.